Somehow or other it comes out different. Want to talk this morning about traveling and 3 prophecies about travel. Joseph was a nearly forgotten man in the story of Jesus' birth. Indeed, Joseph is little mentioned in the Bible, and what is said about him is primarily in today's scripture reading from Matthew. Joseph, Mary, and the Christ child were still in Bethlehem when they were visited by the Magi. And next week we'll talk more about that. By those Magi who brought valuable gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When those gifts were presented, Joseph and Mary probably had little idea why these foreigners had come so far to see their child and why they presented such extravagant gifts. The Magi had inquired of King Herod where the child was and went to Bethlehem when the king's priests said that the prophets had said that the child would be born in Bethlehem in Judea. Herod asked them to report to him when they found the child, quote, so that I too may go and worship him. Herod, of course, had no intention of worshiping the child. Quite the contrary, he planned to kill Jesus. The Magi were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, and they returned to their country by another route. Once the Magi left, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and told him to take the child and Mary and flee to Egypt and to stay there until it was safe to return. Joseph obediently did as the angel said, and the family fled to Egypt, where they lived until Herod died about a year later. No place in Israel was safe for them so long as Herod lived. In telling the story, Matthew 3 times refers to the Old Testament prophecies to show that all that was to happen was a part of God's grand plan. Consider what Joseph was asked to do. Leave his home, abandon his carpenter shop and his livelihood, and flee with his family to a foreign country with nothing but the clothes on their backs. How were they to live? How could they survive? The answer was in the gifts from the Magi. Those valuable gifts would sustain the family until they could safely return. The story of Jesus' birth is one of travels. A trip to Bethlehem, the Magi coming to worship the Christ child, the flight to Egypt, and more. The travel stories began centuries earlier with Abraham and later Moses, and they continue today with us. And Betsy is going to share some of her thoughts on travel with you.
Five journeys. Abraham. Sand grits inside my thongs, sucks at each step to prolong our trek, whips into sweaty pores, round turban folds. God, you promised, and I believe, but is my wandering life a hoax? Where is rest for this aging fool? When does faith let me shake my sandals clean? Lead me to the land of milk and honey, where my creatures and I may feast, and I am home at last. Moses, not only to go as God commands, but to lead as God commands. I am nobody. Send someone else. Send someone with a voice, someone not wanted for murder. I shall be with you. I went. From glorious escape to inglorious desert meandering. From people rejoicing that Yahweh had visited, to people regretting that dark masters were fled. Stand firm, this nobody said. Stand firm to see the promised land. Mary and Joseph. Mary and Joseph are small town folk, their lives bound by the space one can walk in a day. They are settlers, not desert nomads, but they must go to the city. They would rather stay home, home where the evening broth is warm, where the sweet woody smells of Joseph's shop fill the senses. But they must go to the city. So many people, faces unknown, her ache, his worry, obscured by crowds. Yet in a stable, their lives affirmed, Mary and Joseph in the city. Caesar's message and God's message, side by side, one fulfilled by might, one by love. Magi. Legend says we are three, but we are legion, and our search by starlight, a wild chase after a dream. Across uncharted miles of sand, shifting, deceiving, foreign. With baby gifts in hand, doubting our own sanity, as others do. Suddenly we are kneeling, warmed by an infant's gurgling, musty, earthy, stable pungence for incense. The arid journey is watered at last. You and I, to take a journey and not check the time, to know what to pack and what to leave behind, to trek the desert of the soul with no highlighted map, to allow for wrong turns in retracing, to let the plan unfold, not demanding knowledge of conclusion, to believe in unseen realities. We travel a mysterious but historic road, from Ur of Chaldees to Canaan, from Egypt to a promised land, from carpenter's shop to noisome city, from eastern desert to straw-lined manger, from our world to his. We journey to catch a piece of the vision, each step, each stumble, each blister, matched by the promise and now reality of God. Journey ending and journey beginning.
All stories of refugees. Refugees in today's world generally have to flee for their lives to another country, similarly with nothing more than they can carry on their backs. Joseph, thanks to the gifts of the Magi, was far better off than today's refugees from Syria or the Sudan or other places who are displaced from their homeland. For Joseph, it was all a part of God's plan, as indicated by Matthew's reference to the prophet. The first such reference is in verse 15 of our scripture reading, where he stayed until the death of Herod, and so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." That statement refers to Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. This has a double meaning to Matthew. Hosea is referring to Israel's exodus from Egypt, but in Matthew's view, it is also a reference and prophecy of the future. Hosea's writings point to the first Exodus being inconclusive because of the continuing backsliding of the Israelites and their periodic worshiping of false gods like Baal. Douglas Hare, in his commentary on Matthew, says that Jesus is his own person, in his own person, represents Israel, but in a unique way. By his obedience, set over Israel's disobedience, he alone is worthy to be called the Son of God. Hosea's statement is thus transformed by early Christian faith into a messianic text and related to Jesus' function as the Son of God, who is summoned out of Egypt to the promised land, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. When Herod realized that the Magi had outwitted him, he gave orders to kill all boys in and around Bethlehem who were younger than 2 years of age. This is why the Holy Family had to flee. And Matthew suggests this by referring to Jeremiah 31. The prophet Jeremiah is talking about the Babylonian captivity and of Rachel weeping over the death of children at Ramah, drawing a parallel to the death of babies killed by Herod and their weeping parents. Matthew is suggesting that once again, history is repeating itself for the Jews. Matthew's third fulfillment of prophecy begins after Herod has died, and an angel once again appears to Joseph in a dream, telling Joseph to return to Israel with his family. And in another dream, he is told not to go home to Judea, but to go to Nazareth in Galilee. And why not back to Judea? The historical reason is that Herod had divided his kingdom into 3 parts, each one to be ruled by one of his sons. Archelaus was the new ruler of Judea and was every bit as cruel as was Herod the Great. He sent in troops and cavalry who killed 3,000 Jews and an uprising in the temple at Passover after Herod's death. And he continually used oppressive measures against both Jews and Samaritans. It simply was not safe to return to Judea under these circumstances. Galilee, however, was ruled by another of Herod's sons, Herod Antipas, who did not have as cruel a reputation as did Archelaus. So that is where Joseph was told to go. Further, he was sent to the small town of Nazareth, where Jesus would grow up. But why Nazareth? Why such an insignificant place? Matthew said that this fulfilled a third prophecy, that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. The problem with Matthew's claim is nowhere in Scripture does that appear. Matthew, however, is suggesting by his use of the word prophets, plural, not singular, that he is drawing upon a number of different prophetic texts. Matthew is referring to Nazareth as being a fulfillment of prophecy. A Nazarene is a resident of Nazareth, obviously, and those who founded the village were apparently from the line of David. Hence, the town had a messianic name. The coming Messiah is referred to in Isaiah as a branch or a shoot, a nesser. Branch or shoot. The nesser was a designation in Jewish literature for the Messiah. A text from Qumran says that this refers to the branch of David, who will rise up in Zion in the last days. According to one commentary I read, Matthew also points to Nazarene as a slang term for someone from a remote and despised area. Kind of like the jokes in Canada about Newfoundlanders. You know, they always joke about someone from Newfoundland as being somehow or other inferior to everybody else. But anyhow, using the word Nazarene in this sort of a way draws a connection between the divinely arranged association of Jews with Nazareth and various Old Testament prophets who foretold that the Messiah would be despised. Does all of that make sense in today's thinking? Not necessarily to us, but it certainly made sense for those for whom Matthew was writing. They knew the Old Testament scriptures in much the same way that we look at the New Testament. Fred Craddock and others in a book they jointly wrote explain the story in a way which does make clear sense to us today. They say that our scripture reading from Matthew answers the question, who is Jesus? First, Jesus of Nazareth is indeed Jesus of Bethlehem, but he came to be Nazorian by the clear guidance and providence of God, who makes even wicked rulers such as Archelaus serve his divine purpose. Second, Jesus fulfills the role and promise of Israel in that, like Israel, he was called of God out of Egypt. This theme of being God's obedient and faithful Israel will continue through the experience of baptism and wrestling with temptation in the wilderness. Third, Jesus escapes from the wrath of a wicked ruler. Not only recalls the story of Moses, but prepares the reader to hear Jesus as one like Moses, whom God has raised up. This Moses likeness will reappear strongly when Jesus speaks with authority from the mountain. And fourth, Jesus appears here as a providentially favored child. But the fact is, his identity is clearly stated. Jesus is God's Son. Matthew makes room for this declaration throughout the narrative in the way he refers to the Holy Family. Joseph is addressed by the dream angel, and Joseph is the obedient servant, but the subject is the child and his mother. A clear and beautiful way to make reference in a very human story to one who is beyond all doubt, even in infancy, the Son of God. Hallelujah.